When German bombs rained down on London during the Blitz of 1940–41, the city's ordinary tube stations became makeshift sanctuaries, their deep tunnels packed with families, workers, and children seeking protection from the firestorms above. But as the raids grew more intense, it became clear that even the underground was not enough. Stations were dangerously overcrowded, sanitation was poor, and a direct hit on a shallow line could still bring catastrophe. In response, the government and London Transport conceived something extraordinary: the construction of purpose-built deep-level shelters beneath existing tube stations. Dug more than 100 feet below ground, these vast cylindrical tunnels were engineered not to carry trains but to save lives. 8 were planned, each paired with a northern or central line station, and they were built to withstand the heaviest bombing that London might face. Among them, the Clapham South Shelter became the most famous. Completed in 1942, it stretched nearly a mile in length, with twin tunnels connected by cross passages capable of housing up to 8,000 people. Rows of bunks lined the curved walls, stacked 3 high, while chemical toilets, canteens, and first aid stations provided the essentials of survival. Families carried blankets and meager belongings down the spiral staircases each night, descending into a world of dim light bulbs, chalky whitewashed walls, and the ever-present hum of generators. The shelters were both a marvel of engineering and a testament to the resilience of ordinary Londoners. In the midst of war, they provided a measure of safety, routine, and even community. Clapham South became a village beneath the earth, where strangers slept side by side and endured the long nights together. Above them, bombs lit the skies and buildings crumbled, but below ground, life continued in its own rhythm, children playing games in narrow passageways, nurses tending to the sick, and weary workers finding rest before the morning shift. These deep-level shelters were more than just structures of concrete and steel, they were symbols of determination, a reminder that in London's darkest hours, the city refused to break. Hidden from the flames, thousands endured, waiting for dawn in the safety of the deep. The construction of the deep-level shelters was one of the most ambitious civil defense projects undertaken in London during the war. Approved in 1940, just as the Blitz was beginning, the plan called for 8 massive subterranean complexes, each capable of housing thousands of people and doubling as potential military command posts if the city faced an invasion. Engineers from London Transport and the Ministry of Works adapted the same tunneling methods used to build the tube, boring out circular shafts and lining them with reinforced concrete segments. Each shelter consisted of 2 parallel tunnels, each around 16 feet in diameter, linked at intervals by cross passages to form a secure network. Long staircases, often spiral, plunged more than 180 steps from the surface, while lift shafts were added for moving supplies. Despite shortages of manpower, materials, and constant air raids, construction pressed forward with remarkable speed. Clapham South, Clapham Common, Clapham North, Stockwell, Good Street, Camden Town, Belsize Park, and Chancery Lane were selected as the main sites. By 1942, many of the shelters were nearing completion, though ironically, by then the worst of the Blitz had ended. Nevertheless, the shelters stood ready for future raids, and their existence reassured Londoners that the city had learned from the crowded chaos of the early bombing nights. Inside, planners included everything needed for long stays underground: bunks arranged in endless tiers along the curved walls, mess halls and canteens serving tea and simple meals, medical bays staffed with volunteers, and even rudimentary ventilation systems to prevent suffocation in the packed tunnels. Though Spartan, the shelters were far more organized and safer than the improvised conditions in ordinary tube stations. Clapham South alone could accommodate nearly 8,000 people, its tunnels stretching for almost a mile, making it one of the largest subterranean refuges in Europe. The shelters were a feat of ingenuity, combining military-grade engineering with civilian necessity, and they reflected the urgency of a city that lived under the constant threat of destruction. They stood as monuments to the belief that, even in the face of overwhelming danger, London could prepare, endure, and survive. Life inside the deep-level shelters, especially Clapham South, was unlike anything most Londoners had ever experienced. To enter, families and individuals descended long spiral staircases that seemed to go on forever, the air growing cooler and damper with every step. At the bottom, they found themselves in a subterranean world that felt both safe and unsettling. Rows upon rows of tripled bunks stretched down the curved tunnel walls, their canvas sheets and thin mattresses providing only the bare minimum of comfort. Each person was assigned a bunk, often marked with a ticket, and families did their best to cluster together in the crowded conditions. Privacy was virtually non-existent. Neighbors slept shoulder to shoulder, separated only by blankets or improvised curtains. The hum of generators and the faint echo of footsteps created a constant background noise, punctuated by the occasional wail of a child or the laughter of young evacuees trying to find games to distract themselves from the fear above. Sanitation was one of the greatest challenges. Chemical toilets were provided, but long queues and unpleasant smells were inevitable, especially during nights when the shelter reached capacity. Meals were simple: tea, bread, stews, and sometimes tinned food served from makeshift canteens that operated deep underground. Yet, despite the hardships, a sense of resilience and even community emerged. Volunteers and wardens worked tirelessly to keep order, run medical posts, and comfort those shaken by bombing raids. Children adapted quickly, turning narrow passageways into playspaces, while adults exchanged stories, sang songs, or played cards to pass the long hours. In Clapham South, some recalled a surprising warmth to the atmosphere. Strangers bonded through shared struggle, friendships blossomed in adversity, and the routine of descending each night, waiting out the raids, and returning at dawn gave life an odd rhythm. Above them, the city endured firestorms and devastation, but underground, a fragile normality persisted. Though conditions were cramped and far from luxurious, many Londoners remembered the shelters as a place where fear was tempered by solidarity, where people of all backgrounds endured side by side, united by the will to survive. Order was critical to the survival of the deep-level shelters, and the government established a strict system to keep them running smoothly. Each shelter was overseen by wardens and staff who enforced regulations designed to prevent chaos in the crowded conditions. Upon arrival, Londoners were often issued numbered tickets for bunks, which meant they had an assigned space waiting for them every night. Families were kept together where possible, but sometimes overcrowding forced difficult compromises. Lights were dimmed during quiet hours, and people were expected to keep noise to a minimum to allow others to rest. Smoking was restricted, cooking was forbidden except in designated canteen areas, and sanitation routines were carefully monitored. Chemical toilets had to be emptied and disinfected on a regular basis, a task assigned to staff but often supported by volunteers. Medical officers patrolled the tunnels, treating minor injuries, illnesses, or the effects of shock after heavy raids. Posters and notices lined the walls, reminding shelterers of rules and emergency procedures, while loudspeakers were used to give updates or issue instructions. Supplies were brought down via lifts or staircases, everything from food and bedding to stretchers for the injured. Despite the bureaucracy, the shelters relied heavily on the cooperation of the people themselves. The spirit of the Blitz, the famous keep calm and carry on mentality, was alive underground, where strangers often looked after one another's children or shared rations when shortages arose. Entertainment, too, was sometimes organized to keep morale high. Sing-alongs, games, even occasional performances by local musicians brought moments of joy to the otherwise grim atmosphere. At Clapham South, records suggest that during particularly long raids, volunteers would hand out tea at all hours, keeping weary shelterers comforted in the gloom. Orderly routines gave people a sense of control amid the chaos of war, and the government's insistence on structure ensured that thousands could live together underground without the disorder that might otherwise have erupted in such close quarters. The deep-level shelters were not just concrete bunkers, they were micro-communities, carefully managed to balance safety, discipline, and humanity during one of the most trying times in London's history. Beyond the rules and routines, what made the deep-level shelters memorable were the human stories that unfolded within their dimly lit tunnels. In Clapham South, as in the others, thousands of people from every walk of life found themselves thrown together in close quarters: factory workers, bankers, shopkeepers, nurses, children, and the elderly, all sharing the same air, the same bunks, and the same anxieties. Bonds were forged quickly in the face of danger. Neighbors who might never have spoken on the surface became friends underground, united by nightly rituals of tea, chatter, and waiting out the bombs. Some remembered the shelters as places of laughter, where sing-alongs and games of cards offered relief from fear. Others recalled romance blossoming in the shadows, young couples meeting amid the chaos, their courtships unfolding on narrow bunks as air raids thundered above. For children, the shelters often took on an air of adventure. Though frightened by the noise of the bombs, they also reveled in exploring the endless tunnels, racing up and down passageways, inventing games with improvised toys, and treating the shelter as a kind of underground playground. Parents, meanwhile, tried to maintain a sense of normality, insisting on routines like bedtime and mealtimes even in the most surreal of conditions. Not all memories were light-hearted, of course. The shelters could be stifling, overcrowded, and emotionally draining. The smell of chemical toilets, the constant hum of generators, and the knowledge that their homes above might be reduced to rubble weighed heavily on many. Yet it was precisely in these circumstances that resilience thrived. People shared blankets, exchanged rations, and comforted strangers. Nurses and volunteers became heroes in their own right, offering kindness and reassurance that soothed the weary. Stories of births, illnesses, and even deaths underground added to the sense that the shelters were not merely places of refuge, but temporary villages, with all the complexity of human life. For many Londoners, the friendships forged and the solidarity experienced in these tunnels were among the most enduring memories of the war. They were reminders that even in the deepest darkness, humanity had the power to endure, adapt, and find hope together. The contrast between life underground in the deep level shelters and life above ground during the Blitz could not have been more striking. On the surface, London was a city under siege. Bombs lit up the night sky. Whole neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, and fires raged through streets while sirens wailed endlessly. Families returning to their homes in the morning often found nothing left but smoldering ruins, their lives scattered in the debris. In comparison, the tunnels of Clapham South and the other deep-level shelters seemed like another world entirely. Despite the cramped bunks, the damp air, and the smell of disinfectant, there was an undeniable sense of safety. The thick walls of reinforced concrete and the depth of more than 100 feet insulated those inside from the devastation above. Many shelterers later recalled how surreal it was to spend the night in relative calm, only to emerge in the dawn light to scenes of destruction and chaos. Children, in particular, often found themselves shielded from the worst horrors of war. For them, the shelters became a strange kind of nightly routine, descending the stairs, settling into bunks, playing games with other children, and then waking up to a city forever changed. Adults, however, carried the heavier burden of worry, aware that while they were safe, their homes, possessions, and livelihoods remained vulnerable to the bombs. This duality, safety below, destruction above, defined the shelter experience. The noise of the raids still penetrated the tunnels in dull vibrations and faint echoes, but the physical danger was remote. Some described the sensation as both comforting and disconcerting, as if the world had been split in two. Above, flames and terror reigned. Below, life was reduced to its simplest routines of food, rest, and waiting. This separation heightened the feeling that the shelters were more than mere bunkers. They were sanctuaries that preserved not just lives, but also morale. In those deep tunnels, people found a psychological refuge as much as a physical one, a space where they could gather strength to face whatever awaited them on the shattered streets of London the following morning. Although the deep-level shelters were completed after the height of the Blitz had passed, they still played a vital role in the later years of the war, particularly during the terrifying V-weapon attacks. Beginning in 1944, London faced a new wave of threats: the V-1 flying bombs and V-2 rockets, weapons that arrived with little or no warning and caused massive destruction. Unlike the Blitz, where the sound of approaching aircraft and sirens gave people time to reach safety, these weapons often struck suddenly. The deep-level shelters once again became sanctuaries for thousands of Londoners seeking protection from this new terror. At Clapham South, Stockwell, and the other sites, families once more descended the spiral staircases each evening, grateful that the shelters existed even if they had arrived too late to be of much use. In 1940-41, the deep tunnels, with their thick concrete linings, were impervious to the destructive force of the V, and people trusted them more than the surface tube stations or Anderson shelters in their gardens. By this stage of the war, the routines underground had become smoother, with organized food distribution, better medical facilities, and even official efforts to keep morale high. Government propaganda often highlighted the shelters as proof of Britain's ability to endure anything the enemy threw at them, though their very existence had been born out of the chaos of the Blitz. Beyond civilian use, the shelters also had military value. Some were set aside as potential command centers or storage facilities in case London faced an even graver emergency. Good Street Shelter, for example, was used by General Eisenhower's staff as a secure communications base in the lead-up to D. Others stored vital supplies or acted as emergency billets for troops. In this way, the deep-level shelters symbolized the city's adaptability. Built in desperation, used in resilience, they evolved with the needs of the war. continuing to protect lives long after their initial purpose had passed. For those who relied on them during the WWII onslaught, the shelters became a second home, a familiar underground world where survival meant more than just avoiding bombs. It meant clinging to hope until the war's final victory. When the war finally ended in 1945, the deep level shelters were no longer needed as nightly refuges from bombs. But their story did not end there. The tunnels built with such urgency and expense were far too valuable simply to abandon. In the post-war years, the government repurposed them for a variety of uses, reflecting Britain's changing needs in a world still recovering from conflict. At Clapham South, the shelter gained a new chapter of history in 1948 when it was used to house some of the first Caribbean migrants who arrived on the Empire Windrush. These men and women had traveled thousands of miles to help rebuild Britain, filling labor shortages in transport, healthcare, and industry. With housing scarce in London, the government turned to the deep-level shelters as temporary accommodation. For many of these new arrivals, their first nights in Britain were spent underground, in the same tunnels where Londoners had once sheltered from the Blitz. Rows of bunks were once again filled, though now by people experiencing a mixture of hope, uncertainty, and cultural dislocation. Oral histories recall the strangeness of arriving in a new country only to be housed in a place so stark and unfamiliar. Its whitewashed walls and damp air, a far cry from the Caribbean sun. Yet for all their discomfort, the shelters offered a roof, a bed, and a start in a city still bearing the scars of war. Beyond Clapham South, other shelters were used for different purposes. Some became secure storage spaces for government archives, while others were adapted as Cold War bunkers, mushroom farms, or even emergency sleeping quarters during later crises. The shelter's adaptability reflected the ingenuity with which London reused its wartime infrastructure. They were relics of a desperate era, but they continued to serve the city in unexpected ways, becoming silent witnesses to new chapters of Britain's social history. For many, their use in housing Windrush migrants gave them a profound symbolic weight, linking wartime endurance with post-war transformation. What began as refuges from bombs became unlikely gateways to a new, multicultural London. As the decades passed, the deep-level shelters gradually slipped from public memory, becoming forgotten relics hidden beneath the bustle of modern London. Their entrances, plain brick or concrete buildings with little to distinguish them, blended quietly into the urban landscape, often mistaken for utility sites or ventilation shafts. Few Londoners gave them a second glance, unaware that beneath their feet lay vast subterranean worlds where thousands had once endured the worst of the Blitz. For most, the war was remembered through more visible symbols, bombs, memorials, and famous landmarks like the cabinet war rooms. The shelters, by contrast, remained out of sight and largely out of mind. Without nightly raids to remind the public of their importance, they became obsolete curiosities. Some tunnels were sealed and abandoned, while others found new, less dramatic uses as storage depots for government files, Cold War supplies, or civil defense equipment. The passage of time obscured their role in the collective memory of Londoners, particularly younger generations who grew up never hearing the stories of what life had been like inside. Oral histories that did survive often came from those who had sheltered there as children, recalling the smells, the sounds, and the strange community spirit of those nights underground. Yet these accounts were rarely given much attention until historians in the late 20th century began to uncover the hidden history of the deep-level shelters. For decades, many of the tunnels lay in silence, gathering dust, their bunks dismantled, their walls flaking, their air heavy with the residue of neglect. They were time capsules waiting to be rediscovered. It was only when developers, archivists, and heritage campaigners began exploring these forgotten spaces that the scale of what had been built and endured came back into focus. The very anonymity that had once protected the shelters in wartime now contributed to their obscurity and peace. They became ghostly reminders that beneath the thriving, modern capital, layers of history remained entombed, invisible to the millions of commuters walking just a few feet above. By the late 20th century, interest in London's hidden wartime heritage began to grow, and the deep-level shelters were slowly rediscovered as remarkable survivors of the city's darkest years. Heritage groups, local historians, and even curious urban explorers started to uncover the stories locked away in these subterranean spaces. At Clapham South, tours were eventually organized to give the public a glimpse into the world where thousands once sought safety. Visitors descending the long spiral staircase were struck by how intact much of the shelter remained. Rows of bunks lining the tunnels, original signage pointing to canteens and medical bays, and the faded whitewash still clinging to the curved concrete walls. Standing in those tunnels, people could almost hear the echoes of wartime Londoners singing, whispering, and waiting for dawn. Preservation efforts highlighted not just their wartime role but also their post-war significance, including their use in housing Windrush migrants. This layered history turned the shelters into powerful symbols of both endurance and transformation. Organizations like the London Transport Museum and the National Archives began to catalogue photographs, oral testimonies, and architectural details, ensuring the shelters would not vanish from memory again. Meanwhile, film crews, writers, and educators found the shelters compelling settings for documentaries, novels, and school visits. Yet preserving them has not been without challenges. Many of the shelters remain closed to the public, vulnerable to decay, water damage, or redevelopment pressures. Campaigners argue that more should be done to protect and interpret these spaces, which represent both extraordinary engineering and the lived experiences of ordinary people. Still, the renewed attention has restored them to a place in London's collective memory. No longer merely forgotten shafts in the ground, they are now recognized as vital chapters in the city's story. Reminders that beneath the modern streets lie testaments to resilience, sacrifice, and survival. Their rediscovery has ensured that the deep-level shelters, once shrouded in secrecy and silence, now speak again, whispering to new generations about the endurance of those who descended nightly into the earth, carrying with them both fear and unshakable hope. Today, the deep-level shelters serve a variety of purposes, bridging the gap between hidden infrastructure and living history. At Clapham South, parts of the shelter have been opened to the public through guided tours run by the London Transport Museum, allowing visitors to step back in time and experience the atmosphere of wartime London. Descending the same spiral staircases that once carried families into safety, visitors find themselves surrounded by rows of metal bunks, faded signage pointing toward canteen or medical station, and the chalky smell of old concrete that still lingers in the tunnels. For many, the tour is a powerful emotional experience, as the shelter transforms from an abstract piece of history into a tangible place where ordinary people once endured extraordinary circumstances. Beyond heritage tourism, other shelters remain in practical use. Some, like those at Stockwell and Belsize Park, have been converted into secure storage facilities, holding government records, archives, or even private company documents safe in their climate-controlled depths. Others have been explored as potential sites for commercial ventures, from data centers to urban farms, with their stable underground environment offering unique opportunities. Yet despite modern adaptations, their identity as wartime refuges continues to define them. Schools bring students to learn about the Blitz not only through textbooks but also by walking the tunnels themselves, where history feels immediate and immersive. Documentaries and films often use the shelters as filming locations, their eerie silence and endless curves providing an atmospheric backdrop. Heritage groups argue that these spaces are vital for future generations, teaching lessons not just about war but also about resilience, community, and adaptability in times of crisis. Still, access is limited. Many shelters remain closed, locked behind anonymous doors on busy streets, their presence known only to those who seek them out. This mixture of preservation, adaptation, and secrecy ensures that the shelters continue to exist in a liminal space between past and present. They are at once functional and historical, invisible and unforgettable reminders that beneath London's bustling modern life lies a hidden city built not for transport or commerce, but for survival. The legacy of the deep-level shelters is one of resilience, ingenuity, and quiet heroism. Though they were built out of desperation during London's darkest hours, they stand today as monuments to the determination of a city that refused to surrender to fear. At Clapham South and its sister sites, concrete tunnels became lifelines for thousands, protecting families, preserving morale, and ensuring that life continued even as firestorms raged above. They were not glamorous spaces, their bunks were hard, the air was stale, and the routines were strict, but they represented survival, endurance, and community. In those cramped tunnels, people of every class and background shared the same hardships and discovered a common strength. After the war, the shelters continued to reflect Britain's evolving story, from housing Caribbean migrants of the Windrush generation to storing government secrets and later serving as sites of remembrance. Their layered history makes them more than relics of war. They are symbols of continuity, adaptation, and the ability of ordinary spaces to take on extraordinary roles. Today, as visitors walk their echoing passageways, The shelters remind us not only of the terror of the Blitz, but also of the spirit that carried London through it. They are powerful teaching tools, showing that victory in war is not won by weapons alone but by the courage, solidarity, and endurance of ordinary people. Their very anonymity, the plain entrances tucked away on busy streets, the tunnels hidden deep below the ground, adds to their power, for they embody the idea that true resilience often works quietly, out of sight, holding a city together in ways the world may never fully see. More than 70 years later, the deep level shelters continue to whisper their story, of bombs and bravery, of loss and hope, of a city that survived by digging deep literally and figuratively. They remind us that history is not only written in great battles and famous speeches, but also in the silent strength of those who endured, side by side, in the depths of the earth.